Welcome tonight, everyone, to Citizens Climate University. I'm your host, Brett Cease, and we're lucky enough to have both Dr. Danny Richter and Rick Knight with us tonight in exploring more in-depth details behind the hows and the whys of CCL's dividend return to American households. The topic, why the dividend delivery is a game changer. But first, let's do a little bit of a biography. We're lucky to have Danny with us tonight. Danny Richter is CCL's Legislative Director and Director of Research. Dr. Richter joined CCL staff in 2013 after 5 years as a volunteer, completing his PhD and getting paid to do scientific research on all 7 continents. As CCL's first staffer in DC, he established our DC office, where he's been responsible for developing our overall legislative strategy, clarifying the details of our policy, interacting with other groups in DC. He's also overseen CCL's research program leading to our REMI study, household impact study, and this study tonight, the dividend delivery. Rick is CCL's Illinois State Co-Coordinator and Chapter Leader for the Chicago Southwest Group. Rick worked by way for 40 years on a wide variety of energy and environmental R&D projects at the Gas Technology Institute and advises Legislative Director Dr. Richter on energy technology issues. At the Gas Technology Institute, Rick managed projects under contract with federal and state governments, as well as private industry up to $20 million, and retired from GTI as an institute engineer in 2016, now working full-time as a CCL volunteer. Thank you both for being on tonight's call. I always like to start out before we begin the lesson with a review of learning goals. Tonight's lesson should hopefully be able to provide attendees with the following: articulating why recycling the revenue back to American households is important from several perspectives, understanding some of the finer details behind the carbon fund and the dividend distributional framework needed to administer the distribution of the dividend, highlighting the key findings from the dividend distribution study and Alan Lerman's background, and then also being prepared to field questions about the taxability of the dividend and other more advanced topics related to returning the revenue to households throughout your interactions with the public. So real quick, tonight's agenda is such as the following. First, we're going to have Rick discuss why recycle the revenue and also talk about understanding the carbon fund. Then we'll have time for questions, and we'll pivot then to Danny going over the dividend distribution study, and then also the taxability of the dividend, as well as other issues that commonly come up in the field and our responses to each of them. We'll then have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. And without further ado, I'll pass it back to you, Rick.
Thanks, Brett, and glad to be here tonight with everybody. So let's start by reviewing why we have a dividend. Here's what CCL proposes to do with all those billions of dollars of carbon fees: recycle the money back to households. So why not use it in other ways, like funding renewable energy projects? Well, first of all, this is the simplest way to pump money back into the economy at the level where it gets spent, at the consumer level, but without linking it in any way to the actual usage of fossil energy. Household energy spending is disproportionately high at high income, so shoveling the money back to taxpayers equally per individual protects low-income Americans without any complicated or costly targeting or means testing. But it still motivates all consumers to use less because of its universality. The carbon fee and dividend covers every kind of energy. Next, it provides an incentive for both conserving and innovating to make energy cleaner, not only for households, but for businesses. Because it's right out in the open, it also ensures transparency about where the money is going. And because taxpayers are getting that money in their pocket every month, they should really like it. So what about this thing called the carbon fund? What is it? It's the piggy bank for all of those carbon fees collected from coal, oil, and gas producers. It will be established by statute as a standalone account that cannot be rated for general revenue by future Congress. It's like a sweep account that doesn't accumulate money except for that which will be distributed to households. And for that reason, it doesn't grow government. No new agencies or programs deciding whose district gets a shiny new factory or anything like that. Here are the main points of the distribution framework. Every adult of 19 and up gets a full share. Every child, dependent minors, as they call by the IRS, gets a half share, but only up to 2 children per household. So who qualifies to be in this recipient pool? Any U.S. resident with a Social Security number or an ITIN, individual taxpayer ID number. Those are tax ID numbers granted to workers who pay taxes but are not eligible for Social Security. Now, I want to talk about gross versus net proceeds because there are administrative costs to be paid, and the net will be the money remaining to shell out as dividends after paying those costs. So we've compared the budgets and responsibilities of existing agencies like the IRS and Social Security Administration as a way to estimate the cost of administering the carbon fund, including startup costs and population growth. So this is how it works out in year one. With a $15 per metric ton fee, we estimate collecting about $79 billion. Out of that, administrative costs will be about $6 billion, leaving $73 billion for households. So that's a little over 92%. So here's how the number would look in year two. With a $25 carbon fee, about $131 billion goes into the fund. But because the number of tax-paying companies and dividend recipients doesn't really change, administrative cost is still only a little over $6 billion. So that leaves $125 billion for households, which is over 95% in this case of the gross. Let's jump ahead to year 5 when the carbon fee will be $55 a metric ton. So here's how that looks with the carbon fees flowing into the fund as predicted by REMI's emissions forecast. The fund collects $274 billion gross, and administrative cost is still only a little over $6 billion, so that leaves $268 billion of net, which in this case is nearly 98% of the total. So you get the idea. As the years go by, the amount of the collected fees that goes back to households ends up at about 99%, which I think is pretty impressive for a federal program. So that's all I got, and I'll turn it over to Danny.
Cool. All right. Thank you, Brett, and thank you, Rick, for that. And I'll just point out that when I was working with Alan Lerman, the author on this study, I was working on that with Rick. So Rick has really helped me out with this study from the beginning. He really does have an intimate knowledge of the process that we went through to do this, and he's provided really valuable help. So thank you, Rick, for your excellent presentation here and all the work you put in beforehand to get us to this point. So distributing the dividend, how to get the monthly carbon dividends to more than 300 million Americans. So as I mentioned, there was a study. Our expert, Alan Lerman, wrote a 54-page report titled Paying Dividends to United States Residents with Revenue from the Carbon Fee. We made a decision at the time, which upon reflection, I think was a mistake, not to make this report something we put on our website. We put the summary and the 10-page FAQ on our website. We are sharing this report with congressional offices who asked for it, but we made a decision not to share this. And as I said, I think that was a mistake. And we are trying to rectify that mistake. I'm working again, Rick and I are working again with Alan to do an update to this study. Alan Lerman had reservations about sharing this more widely, and we've asked him to get it to a point where he's comfortable sharing it more widely. So this full report will be updated and released in the near future, but this is the report slide. So who is Alan H. Lerman? Well, he's a retired economist from the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Tax Analysis. And for those of you who are at the June lobby day, this is the same office whose report we shared. It was a report released in early this year talking about carbon taxes and what to do with the revenue. And it's the report that suggested that about 70% of households would end up ahead with a dividend. and Alan specifically worked on every major tax reform legislation and administrative reform from 1971 to 2014. And that includes the stimulus checks that we all got in 2008 and 2009. In fact, he was the guy. He was the guy who then Secretary of State Secretary of the Treasury Hank Paulson tapped to figure out how to get this money to everybody in the country. And so that's why we hired him. So why is he explicitly qualified to do this? Well, because he has that experience. And it's also important to remember that CCL is not a think tank. We depend on outside experts for guidance on complex questions of policy and law. And I am our research director, but I don't actually, aside from analyzing the June notes, I don't do any research. My interaction with Remy, with the author of the Household Impact Study, with Alan in this study, is not to impact the research they're doing. It is to make sure that the research they're doing is as close a match as possible to our policy. But I really want to let them do what they are expert in. So we do depend on outside experts for guidance. And as I described, Mr. Lerman is exceptionally qualified to play this role for the carbon dividend distribution study. So first question, how to distribute the dividends? Well, Alan considered two methods. First of all, the direct monthly payments to recipients, which is of course what is in our policy. But as I said, I try and let our researchers allow them some intellectual room to run so that they, it's as authentic and as good of research as possible. And Alan really wanted to consider, how could we do this with payroll? Could we top up payroll taxes? Could we do it via Social Security checks or other periodic payments? And I let him do that. And that was actually the method that he favored at the beginning. But after going through all the details, after going through the analysis, his conclusion was that it made the most sense to do direct monthly payment system was simplest. It was the most flexible, but it does require some startup funding. That's the downside, is that you can't. There's a little bit of time, a little bit of lag to get this fully up to speed. So then he considered the question, who handles this? And for this, he looked at four options. Number one, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. Piggybacking off of the tax returns that people are already submitting made a lot of sense. Second, the Social Security Administration. This is what the Climate Leadership Council has indicated in their proposal would administer this end in their policy. Third option he considered is a new agency within the Treasury Department. And fourth, private contractors working with the Treasury. So Alan went through all of these options, and his conclusion was that option 4 was the most efficient and politically viable. The Internal Revenue Service has a negative reputation, and it, along with the Social Security Administration, are already very highly taxed in terms of their resources. It would be very difficult for them to take this on. And a new agency within the Treasury Department, that has its own political baggage. And if we like saying, this is not a policy that would grow government, if we're creating a new agency, that makes it harder to make that argument. And there's already a good history of private contractors working with the Treasury to distribute funds. However, it would be impossible not to involve the IRS at some point. So then the next big part of what Alan considered is who actually gets the money. And for income tax filers, the person whose name is at the top of the return gets the money for the family, including up to 2 dependent children and the filer's spouse if filing jointly. Married couples filing separately would file separate payments, but could each claim only 1 child. So you're getting 2 children for the couple, but only 1 child per separately filed tax return. And any other adults in a household who files their own tax returns gets their own dividend. So this really clarified going through this study was really good. It clarified a lot of things, questions we didn't know we should be asking. So that's when you know you're working with a really great experts, when they're answering questions for you didn't even know you had. We learned that when we were talking about household, it made the most sense to talk about a tax filing household, the tax definition of a household. Now, how about for people who don't generally file tax returns, people who don't generally make enough money, they don't have to file a tax return? Well, Mr. Lerman created a form, Carbon CFD1, which is a one-page form which these non-filers would file to he recommends that fourth option, the contractor, so they don't have to interact directly with the IRS, and this would make sure that they get the dividend that they're entitled to. So how is the dividend payment actually made? There are three routes that it could be made through: bank deposit via electric funds transfer, or EFT. There could be a federal debit card account. Many, mostly poor Americans, have a federal debit card already, and the dividend could be added to that card which they already have. And for a very small number of households, there would indeed be a paper check. A really interesting fact about the efficiency of this: 92.3% of households have bank accounts. And if you have a bank account, you can do an electronic funds transfer. This is less paper that you have to use. This means that people are getting their money virtually instantly. And as I said, most can be handled with debit cards. Paper checks would be a backup, and really the only time you would be getting a paper check is if you didn't update information. So people who get a new job, lose a job, it's often in that transition that they might lose a bank account and might not get the dividend, but they could just update their information, and then they would be able to get that paper check. So now with that, let me show you the workflow that Alan laid out for how this would work. And he laid this out both for tax filers and for non-filers. And as mentioned, non-filers would go to contractor A because a lot of them would have some intimidation about going directly to the IRS. But tax filers are already submitting forms to their tax returns to the IRS. And contractor A would submit the information from the CFD1, which again is a one-page form. And the IRS would process forms, merge information, and extract and send the required info to contractor B. Now, contractor B could actually be the same as contractor A, or it could be a different one, but it's a different function. And so we put on this contractor B. And what they're doing is they're processing the information. They're handling inquiries, changes, and corrections. So if, for example, there's a birth or somebody turns 19 during the year, they would be the ones who handles that. They're taking calls for people who have questions about the amount. And they're determining payment amounts. They're preparing a pay list, and they're sending that to a pay agent. Now, that pay agent receives this payment list, and they disperse payments, mainly via electronic funds transfer, and then people get their dividend. So residents receive their carbon dividends, everybody's happy. At the end of the year, there's an annual reconciliation on form CFD5. So this is another one-page form which Alan created, and the purpose here is to make sure that people are getting the proper amount that they're owed. So if there is a birth in a year, we want to make sure that people get a dividend for that child. If somebody does turn 19 during a year, we want to make sure that they're getting their own dividend, if they're entitled to it, or if they remain a student, that the parent is getting an adult share for that student. And that's CFD5. And tax filers would submit that to the IRS. Non-filers would send that to contractor A. CFD1 is the form they only have to file once. So then the IRS or contractor A will process form CFD5. They'll prepare a list of adjustments, authorize payments, and send that to the pay agent. The pay agent receives that payment list, disperses the adjustments, and then people get that money. So yeah, residents receive the reconciliation payments. So if there is an improper amount and residents are entitled to a little bit more, then they would get their 12 payments a year, and they would get a 13th payment in order to address that extra amount that they're owed. So that's the process. Now, one thing that Mr. Lerman did address is, does the dividend count as taxable income? And the purpose of this, so of course, CCL's policy, the dividend is taxable. And the reason our dividend is taxable is to make sure that it is revenue neutral. A misconception that I've heard from some of our volunteers is that they think that revenue neutrality refers to residents. Revenue neutrality only refers to the federal government and whether or not the federal government is increasing or decreasing its debt. And that's really important. That relates to the Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010. And if you want to learn more about this, there's a laser talk on our website. It's called 25% and Pay-As-You-Go. And this will talk about this issue. CCL made the decision to make it the dividend taxable because that actually makes it more progressive. That makes sure that because we have a progressive income tax code, it makes sure that the poor are getting more of the money. And if there was a question before this, what about just keeping 25% for the federal government? Well, that would mean that the poor would get less money. And then again, you have an optics political problem that the federal government is keeping just immediately 25% of that revenue. So we made the decision to do this. But as Alan highlights, there is tension. No matter how you do this, no matter how you take care of the 25% haircut, which I talk about in that laser talk, again, 25% in pay-as-you-go, there is tension. And because we do want to make sure that our policy takes care of the poor, Alan actually highlighted that making it taxable could have an impact on income-dependent federal programs. So the poor could have situations that Alan highlighted where, because it's taxable, you could actually have over 100% of the value of the dividend taxed or lost for poor households. And of course, we did not want that. And so when I mentioned earlier, Alan was helping us ask questions that we didn't even know we had. This was probably one of the bigger ones. And what we decided with Alan's guidance is that the dividend and the amount of the dividend would not count for federal programs for low-income households or federally funded programs for low-income households. So that's where we went to. But a lot of this is going to depend on how the CBO ultimately scores this. Next slide. Yep, there's tension. There's a lot of other issues and that Alan addressed. Again, most of these are questions we didn't know we had. Changing into eligibility when a person turns 19. Before we'd assumed 18, but actually 19 is a better age. It harmonizes better with other programs. And then reconciliations at the end of the year, that was not, which I talked about, that's not something that we thought about. Potential marriage penalties. So if you have two individuals, each of whom have two children, they're getting two dividends for their children. If they get married, then they're only going to be entitled to, instead of 4 shares, they're going to be entitled to 2 shares. So you may have a situation where people are incentivized not to marry. And of course, that's a concern. Incarcerated residents, what to do about people who are in prison, and where we ended up on that is that if you're a resident in this country, you should be entitled to the dividend. And then what about people living abroad? How do we treat them? They're not living in this country. They're not buying our fossil fuels, but they're still citizens. So how do we deal with that? All of these thorny questions are addressed or at least articulated in his report, and including self-supporting minors. So if you're under 19 but you're supporting yourself, should you get a full dividend? And the answer we came to is yes, you should. So those are the thorny questions. And with that, I think we're at the end of this.
I would love to just kind of close by emphasizing that if you're interested in finding out more about the dividend distribution, here is the link to go to. It's Danny's contact information, Rick's contact information, mine. We are always open to feedback. If you had anything that you were hoping this webinar wanted to address and didn't, please feel free to email me. And we definitely just want to acknowledge all of your time. Thank you again. We are so honored to have your time tonight. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Rick. I'm going to unmute all lines, and wishes for everyone having a wonderful rest of the week.